Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin, co-founder of the Anti-Greenwash Charter. Join us as we learn from experts on how to build a successful and yet ethical business. So today I was delighted to be joined by a sort of a long-term supporter and partner on a number of different projects, Josh Matthews. He's an activist, analyst and founder at Critical Mass for Sustainability, ex-parliamentary candidate, Chief Sustainability Officer, City Councillor and Chemical Engineer. So he's a very interesting guy with a really fascinating background and sort of segue into all things kind of sustainability, which is where his focus really now lies. Josh was a parliamentary candidate in the most recent election here in the UK, standing for the Liberal Democrats. And we had a fantastic conversation today, just acknowledging and reviewing and reflecting on what the result of Labour's victory means for the country in terms of the green policies and the green agenda moving forward. We touched upon numerous different topics. It was obviously a lot to try and cram in on reflection in terms of what the political landscape now looks like from a green and environmental perspective. But hopefully it gives an overview and a flavour as to what the future might hold. And in particular, we did focus in at certain stages on issues around greenwashing, which are obviously super relevant to the work that we're doing at the Charter. So fantastic conversation with Josh. I just want to say a big thank you to him for joining us for today's conversation. And again, to everybody that's listening in and enjoying the shows that we put together. If you guys have any questions or queries for either ourselves or Josh, please feel free to leave those comments in the appropriate places. And thank you again for listening. So Josh, firstly, just say thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us today. I know that you and I have been in contact and been kind of working together for a few months now. I'm absolutely delighted that we managed to kind of snaffle you to bring you on to join us for a show. Thank you for getting involved.
No, same here. It's a good use of a Friday morning, I think.
Excellent. And in particularly going to be a good use of a Friday morning, considering, I guess, the theme of the conversation in light of recent events. So yeah, really looking forward to getting tucked into that with you today, Josh. But as with all episodes, really keen to kind of start the conversation by giving our listeners a bit more of a flavour of Josh Matthews and your background. Now, we've had some guests, as we've alluded to before, who have gone way back and talked about, the very early days of inspiration, of passions around, setting up the lemonade stand, if you like, as an 8-year-old and realizing that they had a passion for ethical and responsible ways of selling lemonade, all the way through to people kind of starting with, university, professional life, etc. So pitch us wherever you want to start, but just take us through kind of your background and what's inspired you to really, look professionally into the world of ethical and responsible business practice.
Yeah, of course. Well, the weather was never good enough in South Wales to consider a lemonade stand, so that would have been a terrible introduction into setting up a business as hard enough as it is without hamstringing yourself from the start. But no, without going into too much background, sort of the immediate is the whole reason I got set up Critical Mass for Sustainability was one to be able to do my eclectic mix of research, consulting, partnership building for sustainability, as the name suggests, with the right people, the right groups in the right rooms. But it was also sort of molded from an old PhD application where we're considering, well, we all agree that sort of politics, consumer behavior in most every industry sector are not moving at the speed and the scale that we need to deal with climate and sustainability emergency. So kind of what is left to us? And the question then, and I think still is to an extent, is sort of what is that critical mass that's going to pull sort of policy making, people, and all different sectors into alignment with the Paris Agreement, with the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I've kind of come up with, I have a one sentence answer that makes the whole thing way too simple, but it probably provides a nice segue into I think why we got on so well and why I think there's so much crossover between what we're trying to do at CMAS, what you're trying to do with the charter. And that's like that critical mass might be whatever proves so unequivocally that sustainability works on kind of all environmental, all social, all economic fronts.
Mm.
And segue into the transparency element, I tend to use economic all the time rather than governance, because I don't think many people really understand what governance means in the ESG
Mhm.
context. But yeah, I think we're slowly getting there. I think people get the long term business case for sustainability is there, but trying to marry that up with the immediate term business case is often a challenge, even if the ROI is on paper. Getting people over the confidence hurdle is still a
Mhm.
huge barrier.
Well, Josh, you've done a brilliant job of sort of giving away very, very little of you and your background and jumping straight into kind of vision and an intention for the work that you're doing now. You're not going to get away with it that easy. So let's take me back a little bit. Just talk me through, perhaps some of the things that you've done in education, perhaps some of your early kind of corporate experiences, etc. And I think, it's very evident with what you've just described in terms of critical mass, the work you're doing there, kind of where your passions lie now. Could you just touch upon like how those passions have developed and grown over the course of your career? And perhaps I'm going to throw this into the mix as well, touch upon your political career as well, which I think is
Yeah.
particularly interesting for our audience.
No, I realized as you were saying that, to kind of flow into the title of the conversation, I was going to have to acknowledge the political side at some point. But
Yeah.
the path into sustainability was literally one lecture, right? I think I'd accident in kind of my first life as a chemical engineer, kind of accidentally done some sustainability work, like a lot of people end up doing, where sort of before people were really thinking about the embedded kind of sustainability in everything. So kind of bits on energy, bits on hydrogen production, but then kind of flowing into postgrad, and one lecture specifically on waste and industrial sustainability. And just, those kind of moments where it just makes sense. So you think, huh, well, this is a problem, and it seems far too simple, at least on a high level, to not see if I can give it a shot. And it just started making more and more and more sense, and the kind of the sphere of influence, especially because we were originally talking back in what would have been 2017 at that point about cement and heavy industry, that just even on percentage terms, how much of the global pool of carbon emissions is taken up by cement, steel, oil refining, and process industry. Then even the simple efficiency savings, the kind of win-wins of cost and emissions that you can achieve just by operating what is already there slightly better.
Mm.
And that kind of took me into a dissertation, and then into graduating, and kind of an initial sort of research advisory position, which I sort of spent 4 or 5 years as kind of small rogue analyst firm called HFS.
And Josh, sorry to interrupt you, but you studied, just so I want to clarify this, you studied as an industrial engineer, is that right?
Chemical engineering to start with,
Chem-
and then what was essentially an MBA for engineers.
oh, okay. And then, so is that a normal, excuse my naivety, but for a
Yeah.
chemical engineer to then go into, and as a result of the MBA that you did, then go into an analysis role, sort of akin to or aligned with, was that aligned with sustainability function, or just explain a little bit about that, because that doesn't feel like perhaps the most sort of natural of segues.
Yeah. No, so originally that research role was focused on, I'd call it general business, so
Okay.
industries, technologies, different functions within business, so supply chain, for example. And it happened to be around the time that a lot of the consulting, technology, and services firms that company who were the clients, who were the research partners, were developing their sustainability services portfolios, and kind of
Hmm.
got in there at the right time as they were growing up. And it kind of sort of led more and more into developing the distinct sustainability research and advisory practice there at
Hmm.
HFS, as well as integrating the energy, the utilities, the supply chain bits. And this is probably where, kind of around about the time that kind of I ended up snowballing into politics a little bit, that I kind of originally thought, well, I was probably going to just end up on some sort of usual grad scheme. Then it was a PhD, and then it was the civil service, and all of those things got very close but didn't quite materialize. I thought, well, I have no education, I have no history in politics. I might as well dip my toe. And it happened to be in 2019 where the Brexit conversation was still just about live, and I joined the Liberal Democrats, and my predecessor on the city council was elected to Brussels as an MEP, although even for a kind of short time, which meant that yeah, through a by-election that summer, I ended up on the city council a few months after joining, and that then snowballed itself into being the opposition spokesperson for climate, environment, and the city centre, which possibly to start with more so than my professional side, to give me an insight into the real inner workings of an organisation and how to sort of
Mm,
put the baselining in place. Kind of what are you aiming for? How do you develop a roadmap? How do you marry the kind of ambition and acknowledgement of the problem that most people have with, right, what do you actually do about it? What is my internal, external sphere of influence in in whatever job, in whatever company that I end up in?
mm. Let me. It's super interesting, and one of the things I think is so fascinating about you is the sort of the mix, if you like, of experiences that you've had from a political, professional, even touching upon sort of the the educational side of things, as you've alluded to there. But can I just talk to you about how you mentioned the that when you were doing your chemical engineering degree, that lecture kind of was the stake in the ground, if you like, that really kind of shone a light for you
Yeah.
on the issues of environmental sustainability. Like, how did that, and thinking about your then what you did with politics? Sorry, this is a long-winded question. What was it like? What was the feeling? What was the sort of experience that you went through in terms of, did it make you angry? Did it make you inspired? Like, what was the thing that drove you to say, do you know what, I really want to focus my energy and my time on this? Like, talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, the question the lecturer asked, and you kind of nailed it right at the start of the session, was what makes you angry?
Hmm.
And actually, well, his answer was Brexit at the time, but I know we're not that's a dangerous rabbit hole to go down. But the second answer he gave was waste. And the
Hmm.
more he started talking about, especially I said talking about industrial sustainability, the level of waste, the level of emissions, and that kind of piece, like that kind of piece of the overall climate sustainability puzzle that was right there. And yes, being thought about, yes, being addressed, but still like such simple tweaks and such simple efficiency savings that it felt like mind-blowingly obvious um to to at least try and do something in the immediate future, because there's still at that point seemed to be so much to what most people are calling low hanging fruit. It's a bit tougher now, but that still exists, right? You look at most every industry sector, still phenomenal amounts of waste that most people would look at and think, you know, that doesn't feel like it has to happen. That doesn't feel like a
Hmm.
very complex byproduct of of something that is so essential to everyone surviving. So yeah, a combination of sort of inspired anger, a bit of like just kind of, it made sense, really. That's
Hmm.
the best answer I can give. And the more time I spent in it, the kind of bigger that sphere of influence grew. And trying to think, right, okay, which chunks of the puzzle can I address in what ways, and just kept spiraling, right?
and and that's super. I think that rings true to a number of guests that we've had that have come on that have had, I guess, not the same, but similar paths. Here's a question for you: in the time that you've worked in the space, from both a political perspective, professional point of view, etc., like, if you reflect on that time, how do you view progress? And we're obviously going to crescendo our conversation, or focus our conversations, should I say,
Um,
on looking at kind of the state of play in the UK. But how optimistic are you with both what we've done and where we're headed?
Yeah, well, I have to be optimistic. Like a lot of people, the alternative is unthinkable, right? That's on a basic level. One thing I have tried to get across, because I think sometimes there's, I don't say it feels rough to say there's too much optimism, but you might get where I'm coming from in that you've been to various sustainability conferences, right? And everyone talks so much about solutions and that it's under control and that we have new technology coming on board. There are all these great case studies of businesses who've I don't know achieved this. They've spent this much money, planted this many trees, or they've reduced their emissions by this many tons, whatever it might be. Um, and there's almost no acknowledgement of just the extent to which we're monumentally screwed, right? And it's getting like the global context has gotten so bad for so many people globally, and it's only going to get worse for the next couple decades. And almost the question in my mind is like how much can we limit that before? And I generally believe in time we will get to a point where we can drag things back to a very sustainable point. It might take a long time, but
Mm,
almost the challenge now is right. How do we limit that harm to as many people, places, species as we can before we get to the point where we can actually bring this stuff back under under control? And that is one thing that frustrates me is not people not being able to kind of marry the optimism, but still acknowledge that right, it's not rosy, it's not solved. We need as many people working on this as we can possibly manage. And
mm.
yeah, we were just chatting before we went live, right, about the election campaign in the UK, and did climate change get really a serious mention? I know some of the smaller parties, so us Liberal Democrats, the Green Party would bring it up quite regularly, but from the two main parties, despite I'd say optimistic and promising signs from the new government, um, yeah, I wasn't surprised to not see it mentioned, to not see it mentioned a lot, but it does give you a bit of a sinking feeling sometimes.
It's really interesting. We've started in the context of the charter, the anti-greenwash charter. We've started coining this term radical transparency, and the use of that term radical. I'd love to get your take on that in light of what you've just described. It feels when I think of the term radical, it is that sense that like acknowledging the status, continuing to uphold the status quo with minor tweaks and variations to the way that we're doing things in order to realize a sort of a position of we're moving in the right direction
Yeah,
is essentially just completely missing the point. And actually it's this notion of radical change that is critical. It's important within the context of communications, it's important in the context of transparency, but actually that term radical could be applied really across the whole, if you want to broadly call it, sustainability movement. Would you concur with that? Would you have any comment on that in terms of the use of that kind of quite politicized, quite charged term? But what do you think of that
mm.
in the context of this?
I mean, so maybe we've stumbled on what might be the biggest kind of chunk of greenwashing out there is, right? The lack of acknowledgement as to how radical that we're gonna need to be, how radical the change has to be, how deep and systemically we have to change every sector, our way of doing politics, our way of living. Um, and partly the way I'm trying to do now is sort of looking at those systemic tipping points. Like you think,
Mm,
like if we wait to win the moral argument across politics, consumer behavior, business will be gone by that point. So like how do we trigger those points that again show sustainability works for everyone everywhere, and where it doesn't, how do we step in as policymakers? I think that's a good sort of way of looking at sort of where to I don't know, let the market, like globalization and innovation, do its thing, but where to step
mm,
in. And the just transition is a good example of this. How do you make sure that you kind of, even though everybody should reap the long term benefits, there is an upfront cost, there is upfront capital that needs to go in. How do you make sure that that only comes down on the people who can afford it, and also just as well as being fair, then not risking a kind of anti-ESG, anti-climate backlash in politics, and it being weaponized by certain people and certain groups. But yeah, I mean, often people think about greenwashing as I don't know, sort of over, like claiming this packaging is slightly greener than it really is, or claiming that this investment portfolio is has less, I don't know, fossil fuels in it than it really does. But actually, that could maybe that acknowledgement or lack of acknowledgement of how systemic the change needs to be might be your biggest challenge as the anti greenwashing charter.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I know we're not specifically talking about the charter on today's episode, but I think for us, I guess our mission and intention with the charter is, if we can get as many organizations as possible, and we're ambitious with the application of this, but if we can get as many organizations as possible to adopt as you coined the term, a radically transparent approach to their communications, then that is going to move the dial towards us ultimately having a better informed decision maker. And if we have a better informed decision maker on a local, individual sort of stakeholder to organization level, if you like, then that is going to create an overall kind of acknowledgement, we think, of essentially the broader picture. And I think that's where ultimately, yes, it's not the finite solution or the complete solution, but it's certainly that, progress and step towards essentially realizing a level playing field when it comes to decision making. And that's really what we're trying to achieve. I think you make a really interesting point there about, actually there's the kind of a collective dialogue issue at play, which is, are we as a wider society acknowledging the gravity of the situation, and is that factoring in terms of the way that we then choose to communicate? So yeah, it's an interesting point. Maybe that's something for us to contend with as we grow and develop. But Josh, that was really interesting. We've managed to do. I've done the classic thing of spending almost like nearly half of our show this morning talking about you and your background. So classic me.
We're good.
What I'd be keen to do now is just ask you, if you don't mind. We shared an article with you before the show. That sort of, it was one of these pieces that did a sort of a bit of a reflection on the most recent election here in the UK and the implications of it. Could you just start by giving like a flavor to our audience of kind of what was in that article, and also just to sort of highlight from your perspective, what were the kind of key takeaways that you took from it?
Well, I mean, the article was a very high level overview, really, and generally things. Having stood down in southeast London, was reasonably aware of the manifesto commitments from both the Labour Party and the Conservative parties when it comes to sort of climate and the broader environment, the broader sustainability context. We kind of touched on a bit already about the lack of acknowledgement of climate and sustainability for the most part, and despite what was a big headline policy, I think, of setting up GB Energy, to Labour's plans for what is essentially going to be an investment bank to try and rightly so, try and catalyze as much private finance into the energy transition as possible. Barely got a mention as far as I can. Although I will caveat, I really struggled to watch the debate, so I probably missed some things. But I think we, like Liberal Democrats, tried to bring it up. The Green Party would always bring it, and good on them for doing that. Right, we do need that I guess radical and kind of sharp stick. Although I would like without making it a huge sales pitch. One of the reasons that I joined, I'm still a Liberal Democrat, is because I think it's more looking at the plans that we need, not kind of slogans, not the ambition, although we need the ambition, but big interconnected plans that deal with the environmental, the social, and the economic points all in one, and sort of make sure that the effects of everything under the sustainability umbrella do not come down on the least advantaged. I guess that's probably one of our definitions of what a fair society and what a just transition might look like. But pulling back from the Liberal Democrats, although we did quite well. We've got 72 MPs, biggest third party in history, etc., etc. I've been reasonably encouraged in what I've heard from the new government. I think some of us were worried that that the kind of reasonably restrained strategy going into the election might continue into government, but they seem like they're being bold. They are outlining their ambition. Whether it just took the kind of getting over that hurdle and the majority to really kind of loosen them up a little bit. To start talking in the ways that I know they probably want to. Although I think you probably agree that even since the election, barely anything on climate and the environment and energy has really been discussed.
Mm. Josh, let me just take you back. That was, by the way, that was a brilliant synopsis and introduction and an overview and of not just the article, but generally what we've experienced since the 4th of July. You mentioned there about there are sort of green shoots, if you like, of the Labour Party perhaps looking to be a bit bolder and a bit more ambitious. Like,
Yeah.
I know, not necessarily relating specifically to the green or sustainability agenda, but can you give us some examples that you've observed of where you think that those points for optimism are?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll use GB Energy as one of those Right. I think there's, especially given some of the global election results we've also seen. So I think there was worried that the European Parliament might see a far right majority. We avoided that. There's enough kind of central, liberal, centre right, centre left presence there that I think the EU's general leadership in all things climate sustainability will probably continue. France look like they've avoided the worst of the far right, although kind of remains to be seen whether we will end up in a three-way deadlock in France's parliament for the next 2 years. South Africa now have a slightly more progressive coalition, and the Democratic Alliance with a bit of a track record about better managing energy infrastructure. India, Modi didn't manage to get an overall majority. Hopefully, that shifts him to a more progressive position. Mexico have elected Claudia Sheinbaum, a climate scientist. Hopefully, she breaks away from her predecessors' quite left wing policies. We won't get on to what happens in the US. I think that has the potential to dwarf anything that's happened so far. But the reason I'm mentioning all of this
Episode
is,
2, Josh, or maybe 2 and
yes,
3.
yeah, well, yeah, we might need a long time to tackle that. But the reason I'm mentioning it, because I think there's a huge opportunity for the UK, for the Labour Party, through GB Energy, to kind of bind together all of these seemingly more progressive governments and alliances that are starting to spring up, and especially on climate and sustainability, to try and form that almost critical mass, so that even if we see another Donald Trump presidency, there's so much momentum. And partly, I think the Inflation Reduction Act in the US has had a little bit of this effect, but not enough, to almost shield climate and sustainability from anything that he can do, because it's working so well for people, for jobs, for the economy, as well as for the environment, that there is no incentive whatsoever for him to. I mean, okay, he might talk tough, might try and stoke up some culture wars, but actually, material policy won't change that up that much. And for GBNG, I think the proposal at the minute is 8 billion of
Mhm.
investment to start with, to try and kind of either co-develop infrastructure projects, supply chains. 3 billion of that is for to help local government play their role. The other 5 billion for those kind of bigger, more like sort of bigger infrastructure, bigger global supply chain projects, but to
Yeah.
develop it in partnership with industry. And I hope that development also means a development with the European Union and globally, because there are all sorts of additional policies when it comes to farming, when it comes to what they would call green jobs, but mostly like the approach to a just transition. That I think the signs and the thinking is there in the right place. Whether like the proof will be in the implementation, right? It's a bit of a cliche, but it's true.
And Josh, that was. I mean, I don't want to sort of dampen spirits at all, but you did mention that obviously the lack of sort of coverage, if you like, in the week that we've had since the election result on environmental and climate related issues. And obviously I've not picked up on too much dialogue other than, obviously the ED article that we shared with you is one example, but where GB Energy has been discussed. Is that a concern for you then, or are you just thinking that they've got other priorities on their plate during this first week, and that perhaps week two will shine a light?
Yeah, strangely, it doesn't concern me that much. I think I think there's clarity behind the scenes, and talking to some various friends in the civil service and various kind of conversations they would have had with Labour shadow ministers at that time. I think there is an absolute desire to get on with it. Whether I mean, different people will have their say about whether it's the right way or the wrong way, but no, I think the state of politics right now in the UK. I mean, one of my big sort of pushes in the election was for a bit of positivity to come back into politics. So I think anything is going to change until we fundamentally sort out the way we discuss, the way we debate, the way that we, just generally talk about problems and potential solutions. So I understand why. Actually, I think the Keir Starmer's phrase is essentially making politics about service, and yeah, fully agree with that. And no, it does. Rather than getting into too much deep policy detail, I think they've probably done the right thing in talking about sort of a bit more positivity into politics, about
Mhm.
sort of more devolution and bringing the entire country together. That I think we will, obviously, other issues that people would really vote on, like whether it's the health service, whether it's education, have been at the forefront. But I think there are enough signs, there are enough policies in there to start with, that I hope with a bit of an opposition, time will tell what the Conservative Party descends into. But I think between the 72 of our Liberal Democrat MPs will hopefully provide that really ambitious, progressive, evidence-based as well,
Mhm.
opposition that tries to push the government to be as good as possible, including on energy and climate change.
Mm. Super interesting. I want to pick up. I've got two kind of key areas that I wanted to sort of dive or lead our conversation into. This is something that we spoke about before starting the recording, and I think you mentioned how we have a situation with the climate agenda, if you like, whereby when people are broadly surveyed and polled on this, they acknowledge the importance of the issue, but when it comes to the issue affecting their voting decisions, it perhaps has a much less, almost a polar opposite effect in terms of influence. Can you just touch on that, like, and just talk us through? Because I think that's a really uncomfortable truth, if you like, for us that are working in, I guess, the sustainability, the climate space. Just touch on that. Give us a bit more of a flavor around it, and how you think that can change, and what we need to do to change the way that people view these issues around decisions made in terms of voting.
Yeah. So I think that there's two ends of a spectrum in maybe how to deal with it. But on the issue itself, I think I've seen this in coverage of every election, certainly over the last few years, where sort of two distinct questions. One is, what issues do you feel are the most important to either you or the country or the world? And climate and the environment will always come, if not top, it'll be in the top three. But when you flip the question to what will influence who you vote for, it suddenly plummets down the list. And obviously, on the surface, that seems like a terrible thing. But so I fully understand. And this is why, again, this partly comes back to the whole critical mass approach a little bit, that honestly, it's not up to the kind of broader public, like consumer behavior, to deal with this problem. And there is, we almost need to find the really powerful points within different industries, within different ecosystems, value chains, supply chains, however you visualize it, to almost show that this works, show sustainability works, and thereby just pull policymaking, pull consumer behavior, pull industry into alignment in a very positive way with that. But also, I think possibly another one of the reasons for that disconnect is that although everyone acknowledges mostly now the state of climate change and what needs to happen on a very high level, when it comes down to kind of an individual day to day, that kind of that that disconnect between the individual action that you need to take and immediately seeing the benefit, it is so far. I mean, right, as human beings, right, we are terrible at properly accounting for the kind of medium and long term, especially when
Mm,
it comes to any kind of and whether that trade-off is real or perceived. Like, we are terrible at actually making a decision that sort of disadvantages us now in a way that advantages us in the long term. But I think that's obviously been on the solution front. That's why on the kind of big systems change piece, we to get to a point where everyone acknowledges the kind of environment, the social, the economic
mm,
benefits of aligning to whether, again, Paris or the Sustainable Development Goals, and from a policy point of view, making sure again that the upfront costs of that change to get us to a point where everyone benefits come down on the people and the companies who can afford it.
mm,
But there's another end to that spectrum at risk of going on for too long, is about embedding sustainability in absolutely everything. And
mm,
why I don't see it as the original question over people's kind of what influences people voting is because to get to a point, a fully sustainable point, it's going to have to be embedded in education. It's going to have to be like the health service is crucial. Energy systems are crucial. Politics is crucial. Pretty
mm,
much every part of the global context or a country's context has an important role to play. So, like, yeah, there's pretty much nothing that doesn't come under sustainability, but there does need to be a lot of work behind the scenes to sort of spark that systems change that
mm.
pulls everyone
It,
along.
it's but that Josh, that was so well and eloquently described. I think, and again, I'm going to do a poor job of just kind of providing a synopsis of this, but I think you're absolutely right. When you think of education, when you think of the NHS, when you think of healthcare, etc., and you think of the immediacy of the experience that voters have with my elderly parent is having to engage with the healthcare system, or my child is looking to go to school, or these are the things that are immediate to people. I think the number of people that are living in areas around the UK that are experiencing increased numbers of floods, etc. It'd be fascinating to
Yeah.
see what and I've not seen this, but to see whether or not that's had an impact on the number of sort of whether or not their political decision making has been affected by their immediate experience of the actual effect of climate change on their day-to-day life. I think that would be fascinating. Let me ask you. I know you've talked in this conversation about the positivity with which you're, looking at that you believe needs to come back into the kind of political rhetoric, which I totally buy into. I do just want to reflect on one sort of slightly negative Nelly in the room just at this
Yeah.
stage. Obviously, with the election results here in the UK, I think we ended up with the Green Party realizing, I think it was four seats in Parliament, if I understand that correctly.
Yep.
Slightly uncomfortable truth in terms of looking at our overall political leanings as a country is seeing the Reform Party, I think,
Yep.
realize, was it 13 seats, somewhere around
No,
there?
so the 13 seats was the original projection. They only ended up with 5. But you're
Five.
right in
Okay.
pointing out the concern that they got I think it was between 15 and 20% of the vote, which although most of that was taken from the Conservative Party, but still pockets of that I think, were taken from all leanings as just as a symptom, really, of how badly let down people have been by
Mm,
politics in general. And I don't I am complete empathy with anyone who feels like they need to vote for just something different. I would like it if people to kind of saw us as that something different, that kind of more progressive voice on all areas, including climate change, but just the political history. And I mean, how much time do you have to talk about proportional representation in our voting system, right? I mean, that would be one way to solve a lot of these problems, is let everyone vote for who they want and have that vote make a difference.
Hmm. Amen. That is definitely a episode 2 or 3, or we're going to end up with a whole series here, Josh. If we can manage to convince you to come on. Interesting. Let's. I'm wary that we've touched upon some really interesting points here. Can I just talk about we've touched upon, I guess, systems change, and we've touched a little bit on kind of the individual and political decision making from an individual's perspective. In terms of broadly, and I know this is a difficult question to answer, but in terms of broadly looking at the implications of the UK's general election on your sort of forecast, if you like, for business here in the UK, and what this is likely to do in terms of affecting the economy and the commercial world within the UK. Just to touch upon that, like what do you see as being the big headlines in terms of what we're likely to see?
Okay, so I'll touch a bit on what I think is going to happen and what I think will stay the same and what I think might not happen unless we're very careful about it. So what
Cool.
will happen is I think the GB energy investment will come. That will bring hopefully some catalyzing investment into local government, into the grid, into the development of renewable energy projects, planning. I see. Okay, I need to caveat the some of the lack of discussion on climate and the environment over the last sort of week. It's been a week so far. One thing that
Yeah.
has been discussed is planning reform, and I
Mhm.
guarantee you that all of us at the Liberal Democrats are very happy to see this. Basically, removing the de facto ban on onshore wind.
Mhm.
Ultra cheap, way cheaper than solar, way cheaper than offshore wind. When you pull in the kind of whole life cycle cost of to connecting it to the grid and getting electricity from where it's made into where it's used. I mean, that is such a relief to see, not just from a kind of jobs and economic point of view, but like if we're going to get anywhere near, I think the commitment is 90% renewable energy by 2030. We need a lot of onshore wind. We need a lot of solar and offshore wind as well. And someone needs to sort out the nuclear situation in the UK, but that's a less easy task than letting people put up wind farms. I think the what probably won't change, and I think for this probably comes to you guys in the anti-greenwashing charter. A lot of the European legislation, I think, will probably be either kept or will be quietly brought in, especially when it's not a
Mhm.
hugely controversial thing like anti-greenwashing legislation. I imagine I tried to dig around. It's very hard to work out exactly what the greenwashing legislation is in the UK, but that's a side point. But I think the European legislation is probably pretty sensible and pretty
Mhm.
good on that front. But again, we don't have time to talk about the kind of whole concept of trust in transparency or radical transparency that you're going after. But we do need to get to a point where people actually trust the regulation or trust a stamp like the anti-greenwashing charter, perhaps, to be, because people aren't gonna like people just don't have time, right? They don't have the time, they don't have the energy, and we shouldn't expect them to do their due diligence in most everything concerning sustainability. The stuff that perhaps won't happen, and this was never particularly clear when it was announced to COP26, which is the requirement to disclose a transition plan. Um,
Mhm.
that was a very good piece of legislation. I think I'd be calling for like the transition planning for a long time at that point. And they did announce. They said, like, look, every large powerful company or financial institution will have to disclose a transition plan that aligns to the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
And unless someone writes in after listening to this and tells me that they really have made huge strides, are there enough people there to properly regulate this, to properly scrutinize transition plans? I know they've tried to kind of adapt global frameworks that already exist, but that's going to be the real proof point: is, are companies held to this? Are the
Mm,
transition plans fully on point? I mean, there was an article this morning that suggested that 80% of one of the world's largest carbon offset providers, their offsets are completely useless because they're not protecting forests that would otherwise be cut down. That is some really distressing. Again, the time we could spend talking about this. There's some really distressing stuff in there about Native American tribes being approached and say, look, you just keep managing this land as you've been doing for centuries, possibly longer, and we can give you a lot of money because we can sell that to our clients. It's really, really
mm.
depressing stuff. But again, transparency. But no, that it could be one of the least talked about things, but possibly the most important is how that transition planning is enforced on a global level, but in the UK specifically as well.
And I am right in thinking, Josh, just to pick up on that, that was one of the key Labour manifesto green policies, wasn't it? I think it was like, I think in the ED article, it was like the fourth or so of maybe 12 key policies. So you're encouraged that it's there. You're just concerned or hope. Let's keep it positive. You're hopeful about there being a way of making sure that that policy is fully implemented and that these FTSE 100 companies and financial institutions are held to account in terms of producing a full transition plan.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it was in everyone's manifestos, but it's already in law, right? So
Mm,
it was kind of at least the talk had already been done. The legislation is there. But you're right. The key is going to be: is it how is it implemented? Is it
mm,
scrutinized? Are there enough people? Because you see in all parts of the civil service, when there aren't enough people to say deal with refugee and asylum seeker claims,
mm,
that like the system just completely falls apart. Even if not that I particularly agree with most of the approach on something like immigration, but even like regardless of what the legislation is, how you talk about it, if you don't have the right people there in the right rooms to put it into practice, I mean, very few people will scrutinize what are going to be transition plans of dozens of pages, possibly hundreds of
mm,
pages for the largest companies. And just look at the turmoil recently in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, right?
mm,
Even what was the main source of trust in transition planning is now close to, I don't think they've lost their credibility, but they've certainly dented it a lot by allowing so much offsetting to
mm.
be brought into the mix. And like there's going to have to be a role for some form of offsetting, but certainly not the type we're seeing right now in global carbon markets. So yeah, good luck to the people who are employed to sort that out.
Josh, super interesting, and I think we've just about managed to keep it on the positive side of reflection and forecasting. As expected, we've absolutely rattled through today's show, and we haven't spoken about cricket, which, as we've spoken about before the show, is definitely an area that we both could get
Yeah.
sucked into. So that's for another time.
That's because
Always like to finish.
your
Go on.
sorry, my last point is the listeners won't realize we rattled on about cricket for about 20 minutes before starting the recording button. So we've saved you all there. Until next time.
Well, that's actually, Josh. Thank you for bringing that up. We should say, look, if anybody's listening and you think, wow, these two really do know what they're talking about, I'd love to hear them talk about cricket in more depth. We are open to being encouraged to do a show in that, guys. So yeah, please feel free to let us know. But Josh, let me finish. We always ask every guest at the end of the show, and this is going to be a fascinating question to ask you, especially in light of today's conversation, especially in light of the macro broad view that you have, I think. But if I was to hand you a magic wand and I was to say, Josh, you can use this magic wand to change one thing about the commercial world, doesn't necessarily have to be here in the UK, what would that thing be?
As you were asking this question, I think my answer is going to, and this is not, I swear this is not a pre-prepared thought, that this might sound dangerously close to what I think you might be trying to achieve in the medium long term at the Charter. but to have just a fully automated way that like in a split second can validate a company's transition plan properly and align it to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think I've already mentioned it, we've got the legislation. We just need a way of ensuring companies put the plans in place that they need and actually move along those trajectories. So the quicker that you can not just scrutinize their claims and their definitions, but the full transition planning. I think you might be onto something.
Very good. Very good. Well, as and when we've sort of completed the development of our anti-greenwashing editorial tool, perhaps that's going to be the next stage of
Yeah.
development to look at transition plans. Josh, that was absolutely fantastic. Let me just finish then, Josh, by just saying a big thank you to you for joining us for today. That was a really interesting conversation, and thank you for sharing your insights with our audience.
No, same here. Thanks so much for having me.